not talk we can't talk at length about the elements that will be part of that procurement or that may influence people in deciding whether or not they want to bid. Our focus here is really more on people. So that said, let me ask if you have any questions about that. All right, and we have on board representatives from all of the agency. I know I saw Brenda Duhamel from BHDDH. I saw Michelle Zeiland from OHA. Both Yav and Duffy and I are here from EOHHS. I know there's some other folks, but they're all named Elaine Tronier in the chat. So if I shout out to you, please raise your hand and let folks know that you're here. In addition to that, we have various other staff that have been working on the LTSS redesign team and a fairly good sample of folks who will be affected by this initiative. So, any questions about that? So what I would like to do is start off briefly on the first slide is talking again about where we are. Elaine, yeah, right. So as you folks know, we posted a strategic plan. We accepted tons of feedback. We tried to respond to most of that feedback. We updated the plan in part in response to that feedback, also to reflect some of the changing views of CMS on this issue. That's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We have also posted an RFI. The RFI period closed about a month ago. We reviewed the answers. We did get a lot of important feedback as a result of that RFI, particularly about things of concern to potential conflict-free case management providers. So can't go into them in detail here, but I do want to make sure that you are aware we're still open to receiving any written comments and concerns that you have. The next step, as I have said before, is the RFP. Our goal is to create a network of conflict-free case management entities that has the capacity to serve all individuals receiving home and community-based services through all the programs, except in specific areas where there are exemptions, either required by the federal government or because of something like a managed care arrangement in which there is the opportunity to provide these services in a different venue. There is going to be a period in July in which BHDDH will be phasing in some of the services with respect to the population that's under the BHDDH consent decree. For those of you who do not know, the BHDDH program, that's the Department of Behavioral Health Care, Intellectual Developmental Disabilities in Hospitals, has been operating under a U.S. Department of Justice consent decree and is following certain guidelines in terms of when to implement various aspects of a plan that they have put together to ensure that they come into compliance with the dictates of that consent decree. So they will begin implementation on a small basis in July. Again, our goal was to try and have these entities certified by August, begin the process of training, integration, and start moving people in gradually in January. The expectation of our federal partners at the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services is that everybody will be gradually brought in by the end of 2024. So we're not going to wake up one morning and move everybody in. We're going to do it gradually. We are discussing now what's the best approach to do that. It might be a combination of approaches. It might be the date that your existing plan needs to be revised if you're in the IDD world. It might be the date of your reassessment if you're in the elders and adults with disabilities world. A lot of those final details, if you're already a beneficiary, have to be worked out in conjunction with our partners who are moving into this, and also need the approval of CMS. It's just the nature of the beast. So let me ask, any questions about that? The timeline. Okay, so moving on. These are the areas that we paid attention to based on your comments and on comments we received in the RFIs. There were lots of questions about business hours, and that is something that, of course, will be addressed in the RFP. So we do want to say that our goal is to try and extend hours to the extent that we can and be reasonable, try to serve the populations, the very, very populations that are being brought into this project as best as we can, given what we're all confronting, and that's workforce shortages.
What does HCBS stand for, please?
Home and community-based services, I'm sorry. So the universe of long-term services and supports is people who are in institutional settings, like a nursing facility, a hospital, an intermediate care facility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Those are institutions under federal law and health facilities under state law. And then there are home and community-based services, which are Medicaid funded. And we are largely speaking to Medicaid funded services. And there is a specific set of rules that have been adopted by the federal government. For those of you who don't have context, sometimes referred to the HCBS final rule, which dictates the nature in which we must provide specific kinds of services to the participants we serve. One of the principles of that, again, and I am sorry, I should have gone over this before, is that those conflict-free case management rules mandate that a provider cannot provide case management as well. There has to be a distinct separation between the delivery of the service and case management for the service. And case management in this context includes this period of information gathering in which the case manager gets to know the person. It includes the development of a person-centered plan. It includes connecting the person to services, authorizing those services, and then playing a role in the day-to-day oversight and monitoring of the way those services are delivered. But the role of the case manager in this, and this is why it's so important that there is conflict, that we follow the principles of conflict-free, is that they are essentially an advocate. They work with the person on behalf of the person, in between providers, as well as payers, whether that's the state or someone else. So again, that is the context in which we are doing this. The focus is on home and community-based services rather than institutional settings, because that's home and community-based services. You largely have more opportunity for self-direction. There are more significant health and safety issues, at least in theory, than there are in institutional settings, which are heavily regulated. And in addition to that, we try and promote independence and autonomy in the home and community-based setting in ways in which we're not allowed to do that in institutional settings for a variety of reasons. So are we all good with that?
Dan, I have a question.
Sure.
The business hours requirements, who made the requirements? Is that something you came up with, or is that CMS's language?
So, we have the discretion. But we have to operate in a realistic world. Remember, we don't have independent plan writers anymore.
Actually don't. This is a person-driven process, so
Right, right.
they're the drivers, not you, not anybody. And so it has to be based on, if it's a person-driven process,
Right.
and they decide who, they decide how, they decide when. And for a lot of folks, what we found out with the pandemic was that some of them don't even like getting up until noon. They had the option to sleep in. And so you're providing evening weekend coverage options. I would like to see that maybe reworded in a person-driven manner, because I think 8 to 5 is not a fit. It's not person-driven when we start to look at business hours, and when we start accommodating, that's the reason we had to do this, is really to create a person-driven process. So
Right. And we're trying not to violate the restrictions on talking too much about the RFP, but we have taken your thoughts into consideration and everything that we have done. Let me just put it in that way. And so the RFP and everything we are doing is designed to ensure that people have the maximum amount of access. We do have to, however, recognize that there are limitations in terms of what vendors can do. So we are making the requests. What happens is something we'll keep you informed on.
Can I just make a comment about that?
Sure.
Because I am concerned about this also. And that is, when the original special education regulations from the federal government came about, there was an expectation that school systems would hold IEP meetings with families even into the evenings to make it more convenient and more family-centered. And I had to say it, but the entire government, from federal to state to local, has totally ignored that, even though it was embedded in the regulation and embedded in the will of Congress when people look at the actual notes about how this regulation came about. So I'm concerned, because we're always talking about being family-centered, and we're also always talking about how, wow, we only have the mothers showing up at these meetings. Well, unfortunately, when the original laws were put together, the mothers were the only people who were available to go to the meetings because the fathers were working. Now, both the mothers and the fathers are working.
Right.
We're now creating a system that is supposed to be family-centered, and all we're really doing is punishing the family by forcing them to give up income and employment opportunities to satisfy the needs of a bureaucracy that is pretty much government control. I think there needs to be a lot more thought put into this and a lot more flexibility.
So we have, again, let me tell you where we are. We have issued an
Hold on
RFI,
1 second.
right? We have issued an RFI. These are the responses that we received. We have not put anything in stone. We recognize your concerns, I think, from the very beginning, that we want to have as much availability as possible. So I don't want you to get stuck on that one thing. This was the feedback that we received from vendors that were out there. Their concern is that there are significant workforce shortages. They're not sure they can cover business hours, never mind extra hours. So as we move forward with this, we are definitely going to take your concerns into consideration. We've been hearing it from everyone, and we are trying, to the extent that we can, to leverage the resources that are available to meet as many of the needs of the people we serve as we can. So nothing here is set in stone. Appreciate your comments. We will take that back. We will tweak what we need to tweak to make sure that everybody is aware that in many instances, that person-centered planning process is not going to happen during traditional work hours. And we are aware of that. In addition, we also, during this process, identified some other deliverables that we wanted to make sure that would be available to you before we started, and that would be a policy and procedures manuals that you'll have an opportunity to look at, a startup plan, and a continuous quality improvement plan. We also have tried to clarify the target population. There was some concern about who's in and who's out. So the federal government requires that everybody who's getting home and community-based services has to have comprehensive case management that includes, and this is important, that includes person-centered planning and service authorization and monitoring. The conflict-free provisions do not, under federal law, apply to PACE. So that means PACE can provide the service and conflict-free case management. MCOs can provide the service, which is case management, and they don't actually deliver services, they pay for them. So that's why they are exempt. We are in the process of putting together a reprocurement for all of our Medicaid managed care plans, and we're considering how we can leverage this system that we are creating to ensure that no matter which service delivery system you go through, you will be able to receive the same robust case management, which includes person-centered planning and regular monitoring, in a system that will support you from the time you first hit the system until service delivery. So we are very much trying to ensure that irrespective of if you come through these doors, it won't make a difference in terms of the scope, amount, and duration of case management that you're going to receive. Again, the only issue here is whether or not the conflict of free provisions apply. Tina, you have a question? You want to go on to the next slide, please?
Yeah, I just had a couple of just formality questions. When you mentioned the workforce, you're trying to address the workforce from a timing perspective, the 8 to the 5. I see that as a logistic issue. My bigger concern with the workforce is the fact that there's not enough capacity in the workforce to meet the demands of even this, what you're describing as a slow roll, which we would describe as light speed, to shift all of these individuals into a different model. So what I'm asking is, have you modeled out how many case managers will be needed to actually effectuate this work, and how many are there?
We need close to 200. So
200.
let me
200.
just say, Tina, we have to be very careful in terms of what we say in terms of capacity, because it's something.
Oh, I'm not asking you about the RFI. I'm not asking about the RFP. So 200 people right now. You probably, the majority of any providers that are on here, each one of them have vacancy rates currently as it exists, and people aren't getting services. So where exactly are we presuming from a statewide workforce? You said you had some conversations with DLT. Where would be recruiting these individuals from?
So we're not recruiting from the same pool that would be direct service providers. I want to make that clear.
I think that's a mistake. It actually will be.
We aren't trying to compete. Here is what we are trying to do. We are trying to fill a void that we have to fill. We are looking at all possible avenues. Our goal is to have as many people who are experienced and who have done this work in some other venue or capacity as we can. But we are also open to looking at people who are more generalists than specialists, so that we're not necessarily pulling people from provider agencies, people who have a background in social work, people who have a background in person-centered planning beyond here in a medical context. So we are encouraging everyone to explore all avenues to try and meet this demand. Now, let me just say that today we had a meeting with CMS and we talked to them about the fact that we are already experiencing workforce shortages among state employees. And we have some targets that we have to meet in order for this to go forward. And we're not sure we're going to do that. So we are developing contingencies and we will work with CMS and with stakeholders as we get a clearer sense from the results of that RFP about where we are. But I think it's premature for us to say at this point who will be doing this work. You have to remember that right now, there are OHA case management agencies that are doing this work. There are service advisory agencies that are doing aspects of this work. They won't be doing it going forward because of conflicts. So there are a bunch of potential opportunities out there. We are not sure how well they will be mined. But again, it is too soon for us to really fully address questions about capacity. But Tina, if you have more.
Fair question. So fair response, Anne. I appreciate it. So another question I have is really around, you talked about speaking with CMS. So do we have like the draft? I don't know that we ever received what CMS
We're going to post it
responded back.
today. Yes, we'll post that
Oh,
today. It just, we had a meeting today, so we didn't update it as a result of our meeting today. I do want to address one of the questions that came up into the past. In the chat, we cannot establish firewalls. The exceptions that exist for providers to also do case management are largely a function of region. And we don't have a regional problem. So for example, one of our technical advisors who's from Oklahoma explained to us how there were fairly isolated regions of Oklahoma in which they were able to get an exception because there was no one other than a provider who could deliver any kind of case management. So where we will explore every option that we have, but going into this, before we can even touch that, we have to make sure that we have exhausted all other alternatives that are consistent with the federal mandate.
And can I
So
just
that
jump
was
in
to
and ask a
respond to
quick-
someone who asked in the chat. Yes.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question? This is going back to a comment that you made right before Tina commented. You mentioned providers that have service advisors currently doing this work. So we're talking about a workforce shortage. Is the expectation then that if we are in that situation, we have current service advisors, are we looking at mass layoffs? Because that's what it sounds like.
No, you have the option. Anybody has the option of becoming part of this network. Here's what the feds have said to us, and we've made it very clear from the start that some of the way in which we are providing case management and which we are paying for case management services is inconsistent with the federal law. It can lead to steering if we only pay you if that person enrolls. It can interfere with the eligibility process if you are doing an assessment as well as case management, in which you have an incentive to push a person, not push a person, but to encourage a person to enroll in a particular program. So I think it's critically important that you understand that we want as many current providers as possible to participate in the procurement. That's about all I can say about that, but your business model is going to have to change. There is no longer
a DD provider cannot, we're eliminated from this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so then I guess my question still would be asked about layoffs. So as a DD provider that provides service advisement, what happens to that entire department?
So here is my understanding, and I will ask my colleagues from BHTDH to jump in. We see this as the development of a plan, right? The role of the provider is to implement the plan. That doesn't change. The scope of those responsibilities remains as strong as it ever was before. But instead of sitting down with that person over, you know, a 2 or 3 hour period and have a discussion with them about what their needs and wants, the case manager does that. The conflict-free case manager does that. They work with the provider to set up services. And then there's that handoff to the provider. The provider still is responsible, whether it's an assisted living residence or it's a group home. They have to ensure that the services that are in that plan are being delivered to the person in the way that they need and want. So it doesn't change that fundamental responsibility. All it changes is the actual planning process. And when we say case management, it provides a third-party independent case manager. So if a provider says Mary Jones needs additional services, the provider and Mary Jones talk to the case manager works with the department or the agency to ensure that if those services are necessary, they are authorized. But that is the fundamental underlying purpose of this, is to make sure that people are getting what they need in the appropriate setting. It is not to try and take jobs away. So it might be that you have to redefine what the nature is of your current position. Because the role of the case manager, as it's being defined here and in the strategic plan, again, is to assist in building a plan that incorporates their needs and wants, helping the person make those connections, and then on a monthly basis, talking to the person. We have to do checks to see about physical wellness, about the environment. It could be a 3-minute call, and then to assist them when there need to be changes. So that role is established in federal law and regulations and is the one that has to be conflict-free. It does not affect the discretion of the assisted living residents or of the DD provider to say, okay, you need 6 hours a week of X. What is the best way to make that happen? Right? That's not the role of this. Brenda or
I
Heather,
will
you want to
add,
jump
this is
in?
Kevin, and
Yeah,
I will add, just so that the DD community knows, that no money was taken out of the DD budget to support providers or people self-direct and moved into conflict-free case management. All money was left in the budget. One, because it was my understanding that there was a lot of services that were being provided, particularly in the provider community, that weren't being funded. And that money needed to be left in because
right.
as this conflict-free process happened, it still would require provider support that needed to continue to be funded. And we were looking at conflict-free, it really is a new service. Even though there are some things that providers are doing that will be moved into conflict-free, provider support, which requires staff from provider agencies to perform that support, that needs to be funded, and the money needs to be and has been left in the budget for those supports to occur and to be funded.
And that's going to be, so this is crucial. None of this comes out of an individual's budget if they are self-directed. EOHHS has assumed the financial responsibility for this particular service because we are directly accountable as the single state agency to the feds, and it's something they're very concerned about. And we are not pulling funds away from any agency that is going to continue to provide direct services. The exception I want to point out is that the OHA at-home program, which is for people who are not eligible for Medicaid, they will be able to receive case management through this system. And it has not affected their budget, just as it has not affected the BHDDH budget. Is that? So we're not anticipating that we're going to be putting people out of work. Our hope is that we'll be ensuring people will continue to be employed, provide more opportunities for them. And in addition to that, ensure that people are getting the services they need from providers. Other questions, concerns about this? Tina, did Representative Spears, I should
No,
say. Does
no,
that- that-
I'm attending this as CPNRI, like I'm here as an advocate, just like everybody else, so. So
Does that-
I don't think I was asking the last question, that was Marissa, so.
Okay. So I think there are.
And can you just follow up on Tina's question though? Because the last question I heard her ask were, where were the case managers coming from? And I know that repeatedly you have said, if there are any plan writers, anybody who's interested in this, please contact us. We'll be collecting names, because as we move forward with the pilot and the training, you know, we want to know how many people potentially could fill this role. And so here we are in
BHDH is on
May.
that.
Do you have a list? Do you know how many people have shown potential interest?
Brenda, you had a list, is that correct?
We are working in gathering those lists. We've worked with the Sherlock Center to get a list of all the individuals that have been through the person-centered thinking training, just to get us the names of folks, and also through the fiscal intermediaries who also have lists of plan writers that they that are available to work with folks. So that's the list that we're starting with.
So these
then-
people have to be trained, because like you said, they can't
Yes.
be uncertified plan writers. They have to be trained. With it being May, it's 7 weeks to July 1st. So
So there are two different things. Mary Beth, I think we have to have a separate conversation with BHDDH about that transition for July 1st. That's still in the works, and I think there is a plan to reach out to you folks. A little uncertainty about that, how that's going to happen on July 1st at this point. Some hurdles that need to be cleared. But in general, in terms of training, Keavan Duffy, who is on as a member of this team, is putting together an advisory committee, has outlined a fairly extensive curriculum based on what other states have used, and talking to national experts about what our expectations will be for competencies going forward, and what role we will play in ensuring that everybody who is engaged in this process will have ample training. So we are planning on extensive training in person-centered thinking, extensive training in how to use the new system, extensive training, a Medicaid immersion series in which people will be in which we will be addressing how the Medicaid program operates, all of the different home and community-based services, both those that have been traditionally thought of as being only for elders and adults with disabilities, as well as those that have been thought of as traditionally only for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and then an actual practicum. So it's a really extensive 2 to 3 month training period that we are planning for, and that we are providing as the state. We did something similar to this for those of you who are engaged with our person-centered options counseling program. We actually ran a boot camp. It was 4 days. We're thinking more in terms of 5 to 7 days going forward, but we will share that curriculum, the draft curriculum, with you as soon as we get some feedback from the feds. It went into the corrective action plan today.
who are you using for external stakeholder input to develop that curriculum?
That's still up in the air. We have talked to both NASD and Advancing States, who have done considerable work on both of these, in both of these areas. And the curriculum committee, more about that information will also be available going forward. Again, we need to get some sign off about our plans. And then we will be happy to share that with you. Whether or not they will be extended. So for the July 1 start date, Christine, again, I'm going to have to turn that over to my friends at BHDDH. The expectation is they will have something done and they will share it with you. Brenda?
Yeah, so we are still in a planning phase around the pilot or phase in and how we will do that, but absolute training will absolutely be a necessity. So we're looking at how to best sort of make this happen.
So the Sherlock Center will obviously play a role. But we want to make sure that we hear all of the voices going forward for the January launch. So we're trying to bring in as many different viewpoints as we possibly can.
Can I just piggyback on that? I
Sure.
really do appreciate all the work that's being done, because I think I understand how complex this is. However, I have one concern, and that is, so who is the stakeholder that you keep talking about? In my view, as a parent, the stakeholder are my sons
Yes,
and myself in
yes.
some way, okay? So when you say we want to reach out to the stakeholders for feedback about the training, I'm uncomfortable when I hear that you've got some consultant. I don't have any idea who this consultant is, so I don't want to, denigrate this person, but you have a consultant who may or may not be a real life stakeholder, or may not know people.
It's just let me
Sure.
clarify. It's
Yeah.
it's a member of our team,
Okay.
Dr. Duffy, who works as part of this, who's been working on putting this together. And we've been getting outside and inside input. We had tons of comments for people in response to the strategic plan, but we've also looked to national experts, and they're not consultants, they're organizations that put
Understand.
out material. So I'm
They're,
sorry.
they're national experts, and they're whatever they are, but they are not necessarily stakeholders. I wouldn't even consider the Sherlock Center as stakeholders. They're great consultants, they're great teachers, but again, if we're going to be using that word, I really feel like we need to figure out a better way to engage the real stakeholders in this discussion. I worry about going through a training process where we take people who have been trained and experienced in a particular paradigm of service delivery and now say to them, okay, now we're going to totally change that paradigm, which you are doing, which is great. I like that. I applaud you for the change in the paradigm. But by just retreading the same old people, the same old ideas, you may be really missing out.
Oh, I hope we're not. And that's why we do plan on bringing you folks in. I think we have to separate out two different things. One is the push to get something done under the consent decree and the directives of the court order, which is July 1st. That's moving on a different track. When I talk about training, when I have been talking about training, not Brenda, because she's under a different set of pressures, we are hoping that whatever is developed for that phase in that begins in July 1 is something that we can build on going forward, and that we have planned in for this process to have people like you, John, give us feedback. That's our goal. What we want to be able to do is to have a workforce engaged enough and trained enough that if they had to sit down with you, if we had to bring in some folks, real participants and their families, they would be well-versed enough in the programs to provide you with assistance and wise enough to listen to whatever guidance you provided them about how to do their jobs better. So that's our goal, is to be there in November.
But Ann, you just stated the exact problem everybody is saying to you. We're not here to provide feedback. Over and over and over, we've demonstrated we want to be part of the building process. I personally sat down and built you a whole curriculum outline with a fieldwork assignment. You cannot keep building stuff. I mean, this is person-centered planning, person-driven.
Right.
Everything you built, if you don't get today that we get to be drivers of the very policy
Right.
that's person-driven, if you can't get that point today, I don't know whatever version you'll get it for. We want to be part of the building. You talk about the curriculum committee. Well, we're going to build it and you're going to get to provide feedback. You talk about the Sherlock committee. You said that you would engage external stakeholders. Who's been asked? You're saying, well, you'll get to provide feedback. It's the same thing with the strategic plan.
Right, right.
Unless and until you engage us, you cannot keep putting this stuff up and expecting us to say, oh, well, isn't that great? You know, look at the chats over and over. This is
Right.
what people are saying. And
I agree with you, Mary Beth. I just want to make sure that you know, all we are talking about at this point, when we talk about a curriculum, is basic modules, not the substance of them. What will people have to know? Basics. They all have to know how to use the system. They will have to know the basics of Medicaid to help people. They will have to know how to maneuver through a resource directory. They will have to have good people skills, be able to engage people. We're not talking about at the level that you are, right?
And
so
when
you're
we're-
not going to train case managers to do case management. You're not going to train them how to use tools to build profiles and
So the
what-
system,
Yeah.
go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, what Ann's saying is that we just aren't at that point yet, Mary Beth. We 100% understand what you are saying. All we have done is outlined what we think are some of the cores, and I'm very glad to incorporate your work.
Yeah, I
And-
mean, so we know a core module is that people have to be comfortable using the system. There is in the system a tool for building an individual profile. We need to ensure that people know what that means. And we need to make sure that people don't impose their views on the people that they're working with. So those are some of the things we know that we have to do. But that's all we are. That's where we are. Your
And this is
concerns with-
Maureen Magret. Can I
Hi,
get a
Maureen.
question in? Hi, can I
Sure.
get a question in?
Sure,
I want to come to this from the viewpoint of our caregivers,
right?
particularly caregivers, unpaid caregivers who are helping with care plans. And I'm not clear how those caregivers will be assessed during this new process and provided with any education or training they might need. Could you talk about that?
Sure.
What's being planned?
So the person-centered planning process involves the individual or the participant and their caregiver. It can also involve a provider. So I think that that's very important that you know that from the start. There are questions built into the assessment tool for elders and adults with disabilities, which ask specifically about the needs of caregivers. We have been speaking with Intereye about becoming a pilot state to use a separate caregiver assessment tool. We're not there yet. Again, we have workforce shortages just like everyone else, but we will be in a better position before the end of the summer to tell you whether or not we'll be using that. In the interim, those questions are a relevant part of the whole, it's built in to the person-centered planning process. There are questions about what are your goals for the participant? Where does the caregiver fit in with those goals? The caregiver has an opportunity to talk. So we've been conscious of that, and we would be happy to share that with you. We're just doing some of the fine tuning on the system side and testing to see if if the whole system works, but we are open to making substantive changes on that as well. And we've done it in a way, I think, that's consistent with many of the goals of the administration on community living, in that they are an integral part of the process. The other aspect of that, though, and we can provide all the training we want, is that outside of self-directed, there aren't a lot of resources that the state is able to provide to caregivers, aside, again, from providing support, education, and training. So there's not a lot of dollars in the system that can be used for that purpose, as you are aware. But to
Right.
the extent that we have made them a part of this process, obviously, they're critical members of this process. We've done it to the extent that we can.
Thank you, and
If I could just, go
I'd
ahead.
appreciate whatever progress is made with including a sort of a supplement to the
Exactly.
because of the fact that, 10 years ago, we did develop that caregiver assessment tool. Thank you, Ann.
So and there is another thing I want to make you all aware of, that there are limitations in terms of, so anytime we add a new question or we change the nature of the question, we have to go back to CMS and prove that it won't adversely affect a single person that's already enrolled, or that it may not adversely affect somebody who will be enrolled. So we have to be very careful between now and the 25th. So we're trying to make sure that that caregiver, we take it into consideration, but it doesn't affect the scope, amount, and duration of services that a person is going to get. So we're walking that thin line right now, and we're trying to be very careful to ensure that, oh, if mom says, my daughter's here 20 hours a week, most weeks, that doesn't impact the scope of service she receives is today any more than it would have 6 months ago. Until we have a statistically reliable, valid mechanism for assessing what impact that caregiver will have overall. Deb,
And
you
this
have
is
your hand up.
Deb from RA Elder Info, and I'd like to follow up on something Maureen was just discussing regarding caregivers. Across the spectrum, can the conflict-free case management initiative include a database that actually captures the caregiver information?
It does. It does.
So that if one of the providers, say, is taking care of Bob, who's 54 with Down syndrome, there's something in the system that will indicate that, say, Bob's dad is 87 and has Parkinson's and only speaks Portuguese, so that way that information can be captured for future state planning purposes?
It's all captured, right? So we capture not only information about the participant, we capture information about any collateral caregivers. So it would be not only paid providers, it would be unpaid providers. And it could be anything from a nephew who's coming in a few days a week to a nephew who is part of a self-directed program and is being paid through personal choice. There are plans afoot. They are moving slowly to try on the self-directed side to have a comprehensive registry of all people who have been providing those services, for payment, so that people will have a place to go. But yeah, all the information about caregivers, who the person lives with, how many hours. Again, this is unique because we will be touching base with them once a month. So if there are changes, we will be hearing about them. Kevin, you have, oops, sorry.
I just have another question regarding steering for the conflict-free case management provider of services. If they're aware, perhaps the individual needs an extensive amount of care, and there is not a healthcare worker that is available to provide that care in their home, is that conflict-free case management agency able to say, I understand that you would like to receive your care at home on say weekends from 5 to 8 in the evening and you require a Hoyer lift, there is not a healthcare worker available, and so consider this other alternative, or is that
Yes.
considered steering?
No, here's the job. Steering is if we are paying you as a self-advisement agency for a specific self-directed program. Doesn't make a difference if you're actually pushing someone in that direction. A critical component of this conflict-free case management is a discussion, and this is why we were so adamant about ensuring that people know about all of the HCBS programs, not just those that are for one population or another. And the example that you gave, if it was a case in which, let's say it's a parent of an adult child with DD, woman is 86 years old. She recognizes that she's going to need some care. Her son is already getting care. The conflict-free case manager should be able to say, you can go separate pathways. We can provide home-based services for you and your son can continue the way he wants, but you also have the option of going into assisted living. Assisted living will provide A, B, C, and D. Option B might be shared living, and that's where you'll get C, D, E, and F. The goal of this, one of the fundamental reasons why the feds are pushing this, is that they want people to make informed choices. You don't get to make an informed choice if you start with the provider. That's their feeling.
And I totally understand this, except for I'm going to have to tell you that my experience working with these two generations at risk families is that often families say we want X, Y, and Z. And the problem is there is no X, Y, and Z. And one of the reasons there is no X, Y, and Z is that the system has not anticipated the need for X, Y, and Z. So working with these multi-generational problems is really, really important. And there needs to be some kind of advocacy on their behalf. And at one point you had talked about how the conflict-free case management system could be an advocacy
It is.
augmentation. However, if that's the case, then I think you really have to look very carefully at how you prepare those people, because again, limited experience, just John Souza, the pain in the neck. Okay.
But you
My
are a
limited-
pain in the neck, and we
Anyway,
love you.
my limited experience is this. Okay. People come from their own paradigms. And when when families start talking about a different paradigm, people are understanding it's different, but then they also say, I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to go. I don't know who does that. And one of the failings of an attempt to do this years ago through the CEDAR process was that we had a group of people who were outsiders, the CEDAR centers per se,
Right.
advising families who were getting minimal information and kind of mixed messages from the different systems. And then they were told, we'll send you to agency Y. Well, agency Y didn't offer that service in that way. And then there were problems. There were problems in making it all fit together.
So if I could just say, one of the great things that this technology we have going forward, and that's going along swimmingly, is it's going to create this ELTSS record that's going to follow a person, as I said, from the point that they come in, but also eventually what it's going to allow for is a closed loop referral. So when you say that you want to be connected with X, that will automatically go over, that referral will already automatically go over, and it will come back to the case manager with an answer, so that you're not the one who's sitting out there waiting for a response. Kevin, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just know that we're closing in on time. And I'm hearing a lot more questions, and I appreciate all your answers. But I just wanted to think maybe we could sum up where we are on our meeting today. what I'm hearing from the DD community is a strong voice toward making sure we clearly define who our stakeholders are. And to me, what I'm hearing is that our stakeholders are people with disabilities, caregivers or service providers who provide support to people with disabilities, largely parents and family members, and current providers who are actually doing the work, and to make sure that they have a strong voice in how we move forward on defining what the services, supports, and trainings are going to be, and to make sure that those voices are included in all the decisions that we're making going forward. And I think that there's just an assurance that needs to be provided that those conversations are going to be happening, and that their input and influence is going to be very, very, very clearly held to, included, and respected as part of the development as we move forward. And I'm not saying that it's not, but I'm just saying I don't hear a lot of assurance that it is, at least in how people are hearing and absorbing all of this information.
Right, and I
I think
think
that needs to be clarified a little bit.
yeah, and I think one of the things is that again, there are the two different pathways. There is the one that BHGDH is pursuing, in which they have to begin providing some degree of services on July 1st. I think there are lots of anxiety about that, but from the perspective of the January 1st, we're just in our infancy, and we had agreed from the very beginning that we were going to bring you folks in.
Yeah.
To make sure that you had an opportunity. And I didn't get a chance to go through the steps, but this is just an outline. And what we were trying to do here is to outline how it will be different for a person, how there are being changes in the system that are going to make it easier for people to get from point A to point B, and what we've done towards that end. So,
and with all due respect, how can you say a process is in its infancy when you're releasing an RFP in 2 weeks? I am so frustrated and disappointed, and this is not directed at Buddha, it's directed at EOHHS, in the lack of any attempt to engage all of the stakeholders at the table in a discussion from the beginning. Instead, what we're hearing today is that we can't talk about this because the RFI was already issued and the RFP is coming up. There were ample opportunity to discuss options, certification versus contractual obligation, the separation of elder case management providers versus DD case management.
We had that conversation, so I don't want to
interrupt you. It was not a conversation, and I called you the day after the last virtual hearing, and I'm still waiting to hear back from you. No one has sat around the table from a planning stage of this thing and had gotten the best minds together and said, how can we implement this for the full benefit of individuals who are elderly or disabled or their families?
So I think I would again, I take your questions to heart. I am sorry, Peter, if I did not get back to you, but I think the most important thing to keep in mind here is that we are responsible. EOHHS is responsible and accountable for ensuring that everyone has access, everyone. And that means that there are 4,000 people, elders and adults with disabilities, who get no case management at all right now. There are 1,000 people who get pretty good case management, but not in a manner that's consistent with what the feds require. And there's a bunch of people in the DD world who are getting case management from providers in some cases that the feds think is illegitimate. So we have to be accountable for all of those people, not just one population. And we also have to,
I didn't suggest for a moment that any of what you said was invalid. What I
I
said
also-
was you had an opportunity to engage people in the community to be part of that discussion, and you didn't avail yourself
I
of
think
it.
that
And I'm
that's-
done now.
All right, but I do think that that's unclear because we didn't change the position in the way that certain providers wanted us to, doesn't mean that we didn't hear your concerns. We heard those concerns. We took them to heart. We try to leverage our resources to the extent that we can and plan for a future in which the majority of the population in the state is aging faster than in most other states in the region. And that includes people who have physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, who are old, who have chronic diseases, who all will be members of this Medicaid system. So yeah, we hear you, but we're still in a position where we have to take into consideration that we serve a wide population, not just one.
But I don't think that's what he's talking about, because in all fairness, I co-chaired the Conflict-Free Case Management Committee, and in a matter of 5 months, we were not polarized. We brought it to the Quality Advisory Committee and we had an initial buy-in. And then the LTSS interagency work group took it over, and for 2 years, we heard nothing. So you can't say that this is what we did and it's collaborative and we've been working with you, because you didn't. And then you produce this strategic plan and there's been nothing but pushback. And yeah, we can provide feedback, but what this gentleman is saying, hear it. We get all of the people that you have to service, but you know, broad stakeholder input, you know, everybody has something to say. And I demonstrated, because I was the co-chair, that when you bring people together and you consider everybody on the front side, you get a workable product on the outside. I did it in 5 months. In 2 years, we're back to people bumping heads and tripping over ourselves, and you have nothing. And so by your own actions, where are we? Yeah, we don't know if CMS will continue funding, but the message has to be heard, because he's telling you, unless and until you include broad stakeholder input in the building of it, you're not going to get there. We're not going to get there. And it may be your job to build it, but it's my job to implement it as a parent of an adult with a disability. It's Tina Spears, it's Kevin Nerdy's, it's everybody's position to implement it. And so we need to be included, and you haven't done a good job. And I hope if that's the only takeaway you get from this, you need to hear that broad stakeholder input is going to build something on the front side so that you have something workable for everybody.
And I think we acknowledged that we hadn't had as much stakeholder engagement as most people would have liked, and we probably could have done more. I think we've acknowledged that from the very beginning. But I also think that it's important to point out that every single solitary comment that we have received, we have responded to. We may not have responded in the way people like, but we have opened and welcomed, and we do that now. So I'm not trying to be defensive. I mean this. Could we have done a better job with stakeholder outreach? Yes. Are we where we are now because of a lack of it? Maybe. But are we where we are now because we are under pressure to get to an end state? That is correct.
So what commitment are you willing to make today? You're acknowledging, okay, we didn't do the right thing. We didn't do it. You're talking about curriculum committee. Are you prepared today to commit that you're going to include broad stakeholder input? The Sherlock committee, you said that there would be external.
I can't
stakeholders on that.
answer the questions about the Sherlock committee, but we have already included in our plan for an advisory committee on the curriculum to have outsider stakeholder engagement. Again, that has to be approved by CMS. So yes, that was a component of it.
I just want to note that I made a clarification, just because I know it was stated that right now DD providers, and I feel like as an advocate for that community, DD providers do not provide case management as of today. That is the responsibility of the social caseworkers. So right now we do service.
My
coordination.
apologies. You do plan
So
writing.
we're
That's it.
deconflicted as of today, the DD system. So I just want to put that out there. We don't have that conflict.
But do you do plan writing?
We do it in collaboration with the stakeholders, which is
But that's
also the social caseworker that is a DD social caseworker. So we'd be happy to hand that off, but I'm just saying we don't have to get wrapped up into what's being built here. We have been, but we don't have to be. So I just want to put that for the record.
And let me just answer. There's one other question. We do have until 2:30, so let me explain. We can't force anybody to engage with a conflict-free case management entity. It is true that there are some requirements that everyone must meet. And we are talking to the feds at this point about what would happen if a person wanted to opt out in conflict-free case management. What does that mean? So Tina, the issue with the providers is not one we've determined. If you're writing a plan, even in any way, shape, or form, you cannot deliver services. That's their rule, not ours.
Yeah, go ahead, take the plan. Here's to the social caseworkers. There's easy solutions here, and we'll help you. We'll help find the easy, quick solution, but we want to do a slow build, a very intensive person-centered planning. Like, we're committed.
Well, you have an opportunity to do that beginning in July. With BHDDH. But I can tell you right now, the feds have looked at the lay of the land and they have said there's a conflict. And they have told us specifically how we have to unwind that conflict. And that there has to be a clear line between the development of a plan and oversight and the implementation of a plan. That's all I'll say about that. We all agree, I think everybody on this has heard you, that you don't feel you have had enough input into the development of the structure of this. What can we say to you at this point that will make you feel at a more appropriate level of engagement? What is it that is appropriate from your perspective?
Well, what I heard was actual engagement in the decision-making process going forward. That's what I heard. If I'm not hearing that correctly, I would certainly welcome input from the people who gave input or anybody else. But just in a nutshell, that's what I heard.
I'm sure this is not the place to resolve this issue, but I just do want to add one other thought, and that is, I have always believed that there might be a simpler way to do all this stuff if we took the perspective of moving the entire system into a system grounded in the principles of self-direction, where families and individuals and families come up with, here's what we want. Thank you, state of Rhode Island and United States government, for the funding. And here, provider A, B, C, or D, or Q, whatever, here's the money that I would like to give you to help me and my family execute this plan. I think that's a doable thing. I'm not a Medicaid expert here, but I am I live it. And I think that it's possible to satisfy all of the Medicaid angst, as well as make sure that we have a viable provider system that offers specialized support that we can't get in any other way. And that is absolutely the case. And all we need to do is figure out how, who decides what and when and where, and then develop a partnership and how we implement that plan. In my mind, I think that's very doable.
So we're seeing that Annette had a question. I'm sorry, because you're not coming up in the chat. Annette? Kiavan, do you have the question raised in the chat?
Yeah, so does he all work in?
I don't have the question. She had, Annette made a statement.
I'll talk to that.
And I wanted to bring up that we are not ignoring anyone. We're working through trying to call on people. So that's why I had sent you her name. She said that she had her hand up.
Okay, so someone needs to mute. I also want to make you aware that we have significant workforce shortages on the state side, so that's not the answer. Right now, DHS has 6 social case workers. It has 23 positions, and it's been unable to fill them. There have been significant number of efforts to try and retain folks, still not doing it. Still not happening. So even when we are making concerted efforts on the part of the state to try and build workforce capacity, we are not succeeding any better than our good friends on the outside, our partners on the outside. So we are addressing that capacity issue, as I said before, with the feds. I think they're aware of it. And it will have an impact on what we do going forward and what our plan B, plan C, plan D, and plan E are. And we will engage you in all of those things. Tina. You're on.
Marissa, did you have a question before I go? I saw your hand was up. No. So.
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't.
So you can hear the community's concern, and you just addressed the very concern that we brought to you. Like we know that these people are either the people who you are suggesting will be case managers will be coming from our organizations that are trying desperately to provide services right now, because they're the ones who are trained in person-centeredness. They're the people who know this population. So it's going to be very hard to case manage someone without those skill sets. So that being said, you just declared that the state is having the same workforce crisis.
Yeah.
And that's not a good solution. So we're communicating to you the same exact information. It's not a good solution. What can we do as an advocate community to help you with the federal government to communicate a plan that is practical, in the best interest of consumers, and meets their requirements more effectively? Because what has been developed here, and I think you've heard this over and over again, this plan on paper looks like it conforms to a good system. It will create consumer-centered approach. I think it's a little bureaucratic and administrative in nature, but either way, it's what's been crafted statewide. Very complex to implement, very, very fast-paced. We had 10 years to do it. We didn't do it. Now we got to.
And that's the feds that are saying that.
Yes.
So
right. What can we do as an advocate community and to help you with our federal partners to understand the state that we're in, so we aren't treading down a path that's going to harm people or make the system more difficult? So
I don't think that, well, let me just say this, that before we are in a position to look at alternatives, we are obligated to assess the extent to which there are workforce shortages that would have an adverse impact. I think that there are some decisions that have been made that the feds are unlikely to see us or support us in reversing. And that one includes having any kind of direct service provider develop a plan in any way. I don't think that they're going to agree to that. We don't have a regional example, exemption, but I do think that there are other opportunities that we can have to leverage existing resources. I see that stakeholders are calling for separate meetings, but again, I think it's really important that you all hear from one another. And what you're hearing from one another is that you all have very different perspectives on how this should be going forward. So it doesn't help us to talk to the home health agencies one day, to the DD providers another day, to the assisted living providers another day. One of the things we are trying to make clear is that there is one LTSS system, one. That's the way it exists under our waiver. There is one system of home and community-based services. The differences between populations, we can address them in many different ways to try and ensure people's needs are met. But there is only one system. There's not a DD system and an elderly system. It doesn't exist. Look at the waiver. There's one. And I think what's more important about that is that we have to recognize that we have an obligation to move in a direction that's future oriented. Now, within those parameters, we're open to any kinds of suggestions that you have. But we can't continue to maintain two separate systems because separate is not equal. And I'm not the first person who said that. One in which is under-resourced and the other one which is more under-resourced. And I do believe we have to take into consideration that this is an entire population, not just one. They do have specific needs that need to be addressed, and we have heard that. And we are not saying that one person's needs are less significant than another and vice versa. But if it's person-centered, it's not population-centered. It's person-centered. So the individual needs of one family may include an elder and an adult with disabilities. And in another, it might just be somebody who's got a physical disability. In another, it might just be somebody who has a developmental disability. So within those parameters, we are open and willing to have conversations with you, but I do not believe that the feds are going to, in a state this small, continue to perpetuate two different unequal systems. Here, we didn't even get to the point where we walked you through to show you how this would improve the lives of the people we serve. We didn't even get there. But these are some of the fact sheets that we're going to make available. And again, we are conscious that there are mass staffing shortages. We have an obligation to take certain steps if we find that workforce shortages undermine our ability to do our job, then we can ask for special exemptions from the feds, but we can't go there first.
And I totally agree with you. Can I ask you like one question and make one suggestion? My question is, I understand that it's one system, but why do we have 3 or 5 different self-directed options?
Well, that's going to change too. So we have, of course, we have pressures, political pressures that don't have to do with us, but I think we have been trying over the last several months in a self-directed conversation, preliminary conversation, because some legislation was introduced, to think about what one self-directed program might look like.
Yep.
And after we get beyond this tension over this piece of legislation, I can assure you, you will be brought in to have that discussion. But yeah, we do. We have a self-directed program for DD, which allows enormous flexibility, and one that the IP program that offers none, and then one in the middle, the personal choice program, which has a little bit of each.
Right.
So again, is there a justification for doing that? There may be. But if we are only doing it because that's the way we've always done things and we're creating two unequal systems, then it's incumbent on us to look at that.
And Nick's had his hand up if you want to go to Nick next.
Oh, I can't see him. Sorry. Nick, you had your hand up.
Yes, I was trying to be uncharacteristically polite.
Oh dear.
And I appreciate your statements and I understand where the state is coming from. I have followed this process and I've shared it with my members and conceptually, of course, we support this. Many times the home care provider as the end provider gets stuck in the middle between case managers and patients, clients, and their families to make sure that they get the right services and the number of service hours that are needed. Where I was saying in the chat that conflicts with your statement about having different meetings is not on the concept of conflict-free case management. And I don't want to discount what the concerns are from seemingly a very frustrated DD provider population.
Right.
But there are nuances for certain providers.
Right. Yes. And
I
Nick,
represent.
we
Yeah,
are
you
having
don't
those
mind- you
conversations.
don't mind if I finish my statement? I promise to be brief. You know, for my population, my members' population, we have folks that are homebound. We have lived through 4CP, which was a colossal disaster, and ended up putting case management back on the end provider. I think providers are concerned about continuity of care. They're concerned about making sure that they're no longer caught in the middle, and that case managers will actually go out and visit the homebound instead of trying to tell an elder to zoom in while the case manager is in their jammies, true story more than once.
Mhm.
They're doing it from their desk without ever contacting the patient or client. And those are the questions that I've been asking in the various iterations of public comment for months. I can tell you my questions have never been answered. And that's why this call volume is so high, because I have several home care providers that are asking these questions and none of their questions have been answered, including in the chat today. That's why we're asking for a separate meeting.
Well, let me just tell you, in terms of how this will affect individual providers, we're right with you, and we've been having those meetings. But three things, and the strategic plan makes clear, there are 2 face-to-face meetings by the case manager in a place of the person's choice. If they're in a home, the feds require that we do look at the environment and the safety of that environment, and that's for all HCBS participants. 2, that will be a fundamental part and significant change because it just hasn't been happening, we know, on a consistent basis out for some populations, but it has for those who have been getting self-directed, and also for folks that have come through the OHA door. So we are taking in that best practice, Nick. And that has been part of the plan since the very beginning, although there's been some pushback about that. But 2 face-to-face meetings a year, month-to-month calls. And if you guys want to meet about where the rubber meets the road, we've talked to the shared living providers, we've talked to some of the CAP agencies, we've talked to some of the self-directed agencies. We've had separate meetings with these. We'd be happy to have them with you. But I also think it's important and relevant for all of you to come together and hear what each other has to say. So. But happy to do that if you want to see how implementation will, in terms of business process, have an impact on your staff.
Thank you, Ann. I'll reach out to you later today.
And just one more thing, I didn't get a chance to offer a suggestion, and I do want to say this. I think it's really important that I've learned from this meeting today that all of us have pretty much a common goal, which is to make sure this thing works. And I think many people have different ideas of how that will happen. One of the frustrations, totally out of everybody's control, has been the reality that we've had very limited ability to face-to-face, human-to-human interact and discuss a very complicated and very personal problem. We're beyond those restrictions. No matter what we do into the future, I would really appreciate the ability to be in the room with people that I'm trying to work with and talk to. I'm blind. I don't see a lot of what's going on, but I still appreciate being around people. And so going forward, can we have more and more meetings where we are together and more meetings kind of like this? This has been a free flowing meeting. I appreciate that. And give us a chance to kind of not break bread. I'm not talking about food, but I mean, bring our
I'm up
ideas.
for the food. Yes, we can. And we
But I don't
will,
want, I don't
no,
want to
we
get,
will do that. We will
you
do
know?
them more often. We were sort of in this funky period when we had the RFI out,
Yeah.
but we intend to begin more conversations more often.
That's good. I think that will help us a lot. And I'm very, anyone who knows me, that I've been saying for the last 25 years, give me the money, give my kid the money, and let us as a family figure out how we'll best use it to help him and both of them actually have the best life possible. I think we need to figure out how to do that. We need to stop saying we have a workforce problem as if it's a temporary problem. This is a permanent reality. It's not a problem anymore. It's a permanent reality. We need to, as a community, figure out what are we going to do about it. We're not going to be able to create, castles in the sky, given the reality that we have to deal with.
Thank you. Yes, and we hear you. Is there anyone else who has questions or concerns? I think we're out of time. We have a minute.
Thanks
we-
for facilitating the meeting. Thanks.
Yeah, we have a
Thanks,
lot
Ed.
of work to do. We know our deep apologies if we've disappointed you. And not engaging you more frequently. Or if you think we've run roughshod over you, that has never been our intent. It is to try and find a way to serve 12,000 people in a relatively, well, we've been working on it for 2.5 years. So.
And what will happen to these questions in the chat?
We are recording them, isn't that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yes, and we will answer them, and if you would like, we can post them on the website.
Thanks, Ann. Thanks, everybody.
For one,
Appreciate the time.
question and answer public.
If you're comfortable with us, we probably will block the names and we'll put the answers in public.
Sure, I feel like it's opposite. I always thought.
Okay, thank you.
You know what I mean?
Thank you.
So you're saying.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. They're saying the grandmother, mother wants you to go. That's what. I just thought it was